Wuchang is the weirdest game of the year. It may not appear that way at first glance. It doesn't seem appreciably different from a lot of Soulslikes or action games, and in a lot of ways it isn't. Dark fantasy aesthetic, brutal difficulty, slow-paced combat focused on stamina management, it's all pretty standard stuff. Wuchang isn't weird because of intentional decisions or design. It's weird because it's a game that is genuinely bad in so many ways, but has this inescapable accidental appeal. It's a game I refuse to recommend but sometimes couldn't put down. So let's talk about Wuchang. Hello, my name is ianbits, and on this series we take a measured look at games sometime past release. This is not a re-review, and I recommend checking out the official Noisy Pixel review for another perspective. If you enjoy this video, feel free to check out the other videos in this series as well as my personal channel. Wuchang is an action RPG developed by Tensei Games, which I am probably pronouncing wrong. It is their second title, with the first being this weird interactive VR movie called AD 2047. I would tell you more about them, but their website struggles to load and is listed as not secure. It also marks Wuchang as still in development, which is a result of them either not updating their English website, or of them just being honest because this game is very much not finished, which we'll talk about later. You play as Wuchang, a silent protagonist unless you're playing on more recent patches where they added dialogue for her, although in both cases she doesn't have much of a personality. She is inflicted with the Feathering, a mysterious disease plaguing the land of Ming Dynasty China. This disease causes people to suffer memory loss, mental breakdowns, and eventually transforms them into hideous feathered monstrosities. Thankfully, you seem to have some amount of resistance to the disease and just get some cool feathers on your arm and plot-convenient amnesia. Your goal is to... honestly, I don't know. I'm usually good at digging into these sorts of games even though they put a lot of their storytelling below the surface, but in this case, I was just completely lost. I think the issue I have is I don't really understand your main goal. You're sick and travel somewhere to see if you can find a cure, but you reach that place pretty early, and after that you're pretty directionless. You kind of just wander around killing People think you're a murderous beast thanks to your arm, and so you prove them wrong by murdering anyone who looks at you funny. I just couldn't follow the logic or the character at all. Main storylines are never the focus of these sorts of games, but even compared to most, it felt underdeveloped. That's okay though, because a lot of times big armies of insane demons can be a good substitute for any sort of direct storytelling. I think the game does a decent job here of creating an interesting atmosphere. It's not necessarily a unique atmosphere. If you've played Nioh, Wolong, or Sekiro, you'll feel right at home, but it's still reasonably well done. There's only a few areas due to their size, but they cycle through a variety of settings and environments. A village overrun by bandits and monsters, a snowy battlefield, a capital infected and falling apart, and more out there fantasy locations like a spooky forest, and a final area which I won't spoil, but which definitely brings the game home in a satisfying way. The game uses color really well in these areas, and crucially, it doesn't just use the same color. I'm looking at you, Wolong. Each area seems to have different philosophies put into its lighting and coloring, and it works. The game is great visually, even beyond the generally solid fidelity and textures. Some of the spell effects kind of blend together too much since all of the ones that scale off the feathering stat are red, but outside of that I have to give them massive credit for visual variety. It sets the tone and atmosphere well in the places where the story itself fails. As you might expect, this video is going to take a turn at a certain point, but let's keep the positivity rolling and talk about the combat. The core of the game is pretty derivative, but I think it still does more than enough. It's not going to wow you initially. Basic and heavy attacks, limited healing, special abilities for each weapon, slow combat based on stamina management. It's a Souls-like through and through. It seems like most games these days copy this base and try to add a twist, and I would say Wuchang's attempt at this is mostly successful. The big central mechanic is building and spending a resource called Skyborn Might, which is a stupid name, so I'm just going to call it Might. You gain Might points by performing certain actions such as precision dodges, and you can spend them with the weapon abilities and various other spells. You start off with a maximum of 3, but can eventually get more and use them to use more and more powerful abilities, some of which take more than a single point of might to unleash. So far so standard, but there's two reasons this works well here. The first one, as simple as it might sound, is the mechanics around backstabs. As most companies have realized how easily a player can just circle strafe and backstab every enemy with ease, they've all tried to put their own spin on it to try and balance them, from making them only really a thing outside of combat to linking it to a stagger bar and plenty of others. Wuchang handles handles this as well as any game I've seen, by utilizing a similar system to Bloodborne but adding a key piece of functionality. In order to stagger enemies with a backstab, you need to hit them in the back with a charged heavy. This may seem basically impossible in normal combat, but each weapon can unlock the ability to use a might point to make the heavy attack charge instantly, allowing you to pull this off in combat at the price of making yourself vulnerable and spending a limited resource. It almost becomes a central mechanic in the game because of how powerful it is. Plenty of boss fights become about positioning yourself to get those backstabs off, and it's a satisfying feeling. The second reason the might system works is it ties into the various weapons you can use. While precision dodges will give a might point no matter what, each weapon type also has a few ways to gain might that are unique to them. These can be through simple attack chains, or automatically in the case of the one-handed sword, or by using a mechanic called Clash to mitigate damage with dual blades, or my personal favorite, using the spear and gaining up stacks of a buff with basic attacks, then turning those stacks into might by landing weapon abilities. It sounds complicated, but in practice it's easy to get the hang of, and it leads to a unique playstyle for the spear. This is honestly true for every weapon, and it might be the biggest strength of the game overall. I'd compare it to Nioh in how well it differentiates the weapon types. And while Nioh does so with a catalog of special moves unique to each weapon, Wuchang does it by giving these weapons core abilities, and rewards you for performing those core abilities with the might system. Builds are limited in some regards, as there's kind of only one way to play each weapon, but honestly I don't think it's that big of a deal. You can respec at no cost, and those respecs include weapon upgrades, so there's tons of variety from just swapping back and forth between weapon types as you find new ones out in the world. And this serves as encouragement to explore some really interestingly designed levels. The game is effectively just 5 giant levels with sub areas within them, but these are still set up with checkpoints and shortcuts throughout. These aren't open world, but rather a bunch of levels with Souls-like design sort of intertwined together. There's a few moments similar to that elevator in the first Dark Souls that took you back to Firelink Shrine, where you open a door and see an area from the beginning of the game you've somehow looped back around to. Everything feels interconnected in a way that a lot of games fail to capture. When I say these levels are giant, I mean giant. The first level is a great example of this. It just keeps going and going with new areas and enemies. There's huge chunks of the level and bosses and items hidden in side paths that go on for so long, you're worried you've accidentally found the critical path and need to go back and explore everything else first. It felt like they never ended, like I had to have seen everything, but then I'd follow one more path and stumble upon a whole bunch of new stuff. This sort of philosophy certainly has its negatives in that things can feel a bit disorganized. The level design isn't as tight as some of the best in the genre like Bloodborne or Lies of P, but it has its own appeal. These levels also do a good job of really pushing you to your absolute limit healing wise early on. They can be extremely tough to make it through without dying twice and losing souls, which is made even more difficult by a system that slowly makes you take more and more damage, and will occasionally spawn a mini boss for you to duel to get your bloodstain back. It's a lot. It's the type of game that makes you worried when you see a clearing or a big structure, because you're not sure if it's a new checkpoint or a new boss, and guessing wrong could mean losing multiple levels worth of souls. It's definitely not a style of level design that's going to be for everyone, but it has its own twisted appeal. One negative I'd put forward is that I wish it used the environments more to force interesting combat scenarios. It tends to just rely on big packs of enemies that can absolutely melt you. As much as people hate stuff like the poison swamps that plague FromSoft titles, stuff like that can really spice up an experience by differentiating the levels. And while Wuchang certainly does some of that, it could stand to shift things up a bit more. Still, the level design is well above average in a genre where level design is quite possibly the most important aspect. So, dear viewer, you may be wondering where the weirdness comes in, where the badness comes in, after it seems to have nailed a lot of what it needs to. Well, Wuchang has a trifecta of badness, a trifecta of things that bring the entire experience down and weirdly back up. That trifecta is unoriginality, polish, and balance. Let's start with the least important among those. This game is nothing you haven't seen before. Setting, combat flow, environments, story, you've seen everything this game is offering either in other Souls-likes or other action games, and often you've seen it better. This is a genre that is incredibly difficult to stand out in, but the positive things I mentioned with combat and level design aren't enough to do that. This doesn't have the twists on the genre that make games like Nioh and Remnant so good. It's too comfortable comfortable being just another Soulslike on the pile. That being said, unoriginality isn't a death sentence. Lies of P had a lot of the same feeling with how much it borrowed from Bloodborne, but you have to make up that ground in other ways like Lies of P did with polish and atmosphere. That brings us to polish, which is where Wuchang starts to completely go off the rails. The frame rate is inconsistent on PS5, and while you could try your luck on PC, the performance there is abysmal as it is with most Unreal 5 games. It tries to compensate with DLSS, but as you might expect, that comes with its own issues. There were boss fights, specifically the one where the game forces you to parry, where the shimmer from the game using DLSS to compensate for poor optimization legitimately made it hard to see the boss's attacks. Just from this one aspect, you can tell this game was released before it should have been. Equally damning is the base combat feel, which is just off slightly. It almost feels like your weapon is hitching each time an attack connects, but not in a way that feels weighty or realistic. It just feels janky. The hitboxes are also a complete mess, and in some of the bosses that stumped me for a bit, I legitimately think hitboxes were the #1 thing making me stuck. They can feel like they're completely and utterly divorced from what you're actually seeing. Certain builds feel like they need a total rework, with magic focus builds having poor scaling and completely useless intended weapons like the mage sword that does so little damage that it might as well just be a wand. Enemy placement can seem haphazard and random, and certain enemies clearly needed more work in their animations. There is very clearly not enough care put into this game to ensure that each setback is the result of the player and not the game. This brings us to the worst of the three, which is balance. I wouldn't say this game is a massive outlier in terms of difficulty. In fact, I'd probably put it as easier than something like Bloodborne, although it is certainly brutal at times. Difficulty and fairness are two different things, and I don't think they screwed up the former, but this game is far too often unfair and extremely uneven. It swings wildly from fine to absurd seemingly at random. Most of this difficulty comes in the levels themselves, with certain areas just being a mess of way too many enemies jumbled together. The bosses, on the other hand, swing the other way. They're way too easy most of the time. I was first trying a lot of them, and of the ones I got stuck on, the one that took the longest was the one that forced you to use the poorly implemented and janky parry system that doesn't even add anything to enemy stagger bars upon a successful parry. Certain enemies, like the stupid poison pot enemies, have nigh infinite attack chains with no recovery time and insane stagger resistance. Then you'll face a massive dangerous looking enemy that just dies to a single backstab. Everything feels like it's too much or too little to deal with. It almost never finds the sweet spot. Here's the thing though, at the beginning of this video I mentioned that I couldn't put the game down. It wasn't because of the combat or the level design that I praised before. It wasn't because of the atmosphere. The reason I got hooked on this game, why I wanted to keep playing, was because of the poor balance and lack of polish. Let me try to explain. I don't know if I have ever, in my life, played a game that so viciously hated the player. Every decision, every quirk and flaw creates this perfect storm where the game hates you so much and doesn't care in the slightest about providing a balanced experience. Yet it somehow becomes this endearing, entrancing quality about it. It's like that thing in Civilization where Gandhi's aggression being set so low means it can wrap around and make him nuke the entire planet. The game's lack of polish and balance become the thing that fixes its lack of originality, the thing that makes it stand out. Getting obliterated in 2 hits from an enemy with an absurd moveset, walking over and over into impossible to see and oversaturated fields of landmines, including one set hilariously right in the middle of a boss run. It made me angry in that positive way that ended with me wanting to play just so I could tell the game to go f itself right back. So I could say that I beat it and it couldn't beat me, even when it was making up its own rules and still breaking them. It pushed past that normal anxiety that Soulslikes go for and decided to populate an entire game full of rakes for you to step on, but each one made me want to keep going. Obviously, this sort of appeal is not going to be universal among players, and even for people who like this sort of stuff, you need to be in the right mood for that type of experience. That's why I'm not going to recommend the game despite enjoying it. This has the appeal of some random low-budget action game you'd find on the PS2, where the difficulty would be completely out of whack, but you felt compelled to look for exploits and ways around it. Something where you can't even argue to yourself that a boss isn't bullshit, but you have to beat it because it's bullshit. It's a feeling I haven't felt from a game in years, maybe decades, and it became the defining, unique selling point of the experience to me. However, it's also a reminder of how modern gaming inconveniences can put a damper on things, because they've slowly begun patching a lot of these things out. The difficulty is being lowered, the landmines are more sparse both literally and figuratively, and in becoming more balanced, it seems like it's sanding off the sharp edges that were poking me in the eye and giving it character. At the risk of sounding old, you couldn't wait for a patch to beat that bullshit PS2 game. You had to nut up and kick the game's ass right back. It makes me think that this appeal I found was purely accidental, and it will patch itself into being another 7 or 8 out of 10, another indistinguishable Soulslike. And that's not even mentioning how they hastily patched the ability to kill Ming Dynasty soldiers out of the game because of blowback from certain Chinese communities, making the final act an absolute cakewalk as they're one of the major enemies and they just don't attack now. It's another part of the reason I can't give this a recommendation, because I have no idea if my experience will be even recognizable to what the game is in a year. I doubt it will become less uneven or have better hitboxes, and it certainly won't become any more original or distinct in setting, tone, and atmosphere, but it will become more balanced, and in my opinion, less interesting as it does. This game is probably the hardest one I've tried to describe in any video I've made. Seeing a game aim for something and miss, but accidentally hit something completely different is a bizarre feeling. Wuchang wanted to be the next big Chinese action game, the next big Souls-like, but it isn't that. It doesn't do anything different or well enough to be that. What it is a game where the flaw is elevated above the blandness that should bring it down. It's a game I thoroughly enjoyed, but absolutely do not recommend. It is without a doubt the weirdest game I've played this year. Thanks for watching, consider leaving a comment, and remember to subscribe to Noisy Pixel for more news and reviews.